Of our lecture series of group by. Group by allows us to aggregate columns per some category. Let's first explore this idea with a simple example, and then we'll go over the SQL syntax. Let's imagine we have the following table. We have some sort of category column. Here we have A's, B's, and C's, and then some data value associated with them, such as 10, 5, 2, etc. We can imagine that maybe the category here stands for some sort of company, and the data value is how much we sold to that company. So we had one deal of $10 for company A, later on we had a $5 deal for company A, then a $2 deal for company B, and so on. So when we're actually performing a group by, there's a couple of key things to consider. The first is this category column. We need to choose a categorical column to perform the group by on. That is to say, categorical columns are non-continuous, or at least we're treating them as non-continuous for the sake of the group by. Now, something to keep in mind is these can actually still be numerical, such as cabin class categories on a ship, class 1, 2, 3, and so on. And you should also keep in mind that they actually may appear continuous, but you could treat them as a category. For example, if you recall to our DVD rental database, we have different rental rates available, such as 99 cents, $1.99, $2.99, etc. We could treat each of those rental rates as its own separate class or own separate category. So just because something is being treated as categorical doesn't necessarily mean it's non-numeric. And we're going to see different examples of that in the next lecture when we actually program out in SQL some group by statements. But let's first go through the idea of what a group by actually does and how it relates to aggregate function calls. So the way a group by operates is the following. We have already chosen our categorical column. Then what we're going to do is essentially split this table up on a per category basis. So we have everything that went with category A, then B, then C. And then we have the corresponding data values. Recall that an aggregate function takes in multiple values and reduces them back down to one single value, such as the sum function can take in all these values per category or grouped by category and then return back their sum. So the total sum of sales to category A was 15, 6 to B, and then 18 to C. And we could do this with any of the aggregate functions that we just learned about. For example, we could take the average data value per category, 7.5, 3, and 9. We can even do something like a count per category. In this case, there was 2 rows per category, so they're all the same, 2, 2, and 2. So let's actually explore the general syntax. So the most basic group by call looks like this. We select some sort of category column or something we've deemed to be categorical, and then we choose to perform some aggregate function on the data column. So AGG here is just some placeholder for some aggregate function on some data column. We select it from the table, and then immediately after that, we call group by that category column. So the group by clause must appear right after a from statement or right after a where statement. So if you want, before you do the group by, you can filter things out using a where statement. So here we see just grouping everything together by the category. But if we wanted to, before we actually execute that group by, we could have done a where statement, essentially saying something like where category column is not equal to A, essentially ignoring all the A categories before we went ahead and did the group by. So the thing to keep in mind is the group by either has to come directly after a from statement or directly after a where statement. Now, one of the most important things to realize when learning about group by is the following. In the actual select statement, columns must either have an aggregate function call on them or be themselves in the group by call. So what does that actually mean? This is where beginners often get tripped up in learning about group by, so pay close attention to this one. So if we're using a group by statement, then if we're selecting that particular column just by itself, it must be included in the group by statement. So notice here, I've decided to select the category column, then that particular column must also appear in the group by statement. The only exception to this is if I'm calling some sort of aggregate function on the column itself. So in this case, because I'm aggregating something on the data column, it does not need to be included in the group by statement. So let's imagine a different example. We can have something like select company, division, and then sum of sales. So we can imagine we had 3 columns in this table. One were different companies, and then the divisions within that company, and then different sales per division per company. So what we're doing here is, again, notice that if I'm selecting a column, such as company and division, then they must also appear in the group by statement. So that means we can group by multiple columns, and we essentially just decide the order to group by, in a very similar fashion that we decided the ordering of different columns when we learned about the order by statement. So again, here I'm selecting column and division. Since they don't have an aggregate function, they must appear in the group by clause. Notice again, the sales doesn't appear in the group by statement, which means it must have an aggregate function associated with it. So essentially what this is returning is the total sum of sales per division per company. And keep in mind that the where statements should not refer to the aggregation result. So you shouldn't be trying to do any filtering using a where statement on sum of sales in this case. Later on, we are going to learn how to do that using the having statement to filter on those results. But for right now, if you are using a where statement in conjunction with a group by, that where statement shouldn't make a reference to what is being aggregated, such as sum of sales. That is what the having statement is for, that we're going to learn about later. So notice what we're doing here is we're saying select company division sum of sales from finance table, where division is in marketing and transport, essentially filtering out the divisions before we actually perform the group by on the company and division. And again, notice here, company and division appear in the group by, sales does not because it has the aggregate function associated with it. Here's another example that if you want to sort the results based on the aggregate, you have to make sure to reference the entire function. So in a simpler example here, let's say we wanted to sum the sales, total sales per company. Then we could select company, sum of those sales from the table. We would group by company. And then the other thing to notice here is if I actually wanted to order by the sum of sales, I don't just say order by sales. I have to say order by the sum of sales. So notice that whatever I'm ordering by, that total statement should exist somewhere in that select clause. And then you could add something like limit 5, which would essentially show you kind of the top 5 sales or bottom 5 sales, depending if you did ascending or descending order per company. All right, so I know we just went over a lot of this, and it's best learned through practice. So I'll see you in part 2 in the next lecture, where we actually practice on our own DVD rental database. I'll see you there.